It's nice to be out of the 40, 50 degree struggle that we're facing in Ann Arbor these days. We're having a tough time getting out of winter. I heard through the rumor vine here it may rain today in this area, but I look at a warm, wet day it's better than a cold, sunny day. So I'm glad to be here. I really am. The other reason I'm really glad to be here is, working for Terumo and being involved internally with the development of new products. I've had the opportunity to see the CDI-550 coming along in development and be involved in the background research on the product and what it means to perfusionists going forward. And I am truly excited about what the change from the 500 to the 550 is going to mean to perfusionists. And the change really is, let's see. Got to figure this out, sorry. There we go. I'll just do it on the laptop. So the major change to the 550 is the fact that we're now offering a indexed DO2 capability. So you'll be able to see oxygen delivery occurring in basically a real-time fashion while you're on bypass. And when I consider the amount of research that's evolved in the last 15 years now since the first Ranucci paper in 2005, looking at DO2s makes so much sense to me that I hope it does to you all too. As you build into goal-directed perfusion therapies in your practice, it's really going to aid those sorts of events, and there are just incredible benefits that are going to be brought to your patients and also your hospital, because you're going to see some really interesting changes. I'm going to preface this next slide by saying this is my only old guy slide that I put in here. You have to have one of those as somebody who's been in the field for a while, and I always warn my kids when I'm going to tell them something that might be considered historic. So I just wanted to warn you if you want to turn away. Flying Blind is the title of this slide, and what I'm illustrating here is that in 1980, when I started in perfusion, we did not have the ability to look at a handheld blood gas analyzer or CDI technology. It just didn't exist. When we ran cases back then, we were looking at the color difference of the blood. If we had venous saturations on the pump, it was a great day. But as you probably will learn, venous saturations aren't really the best indicator of perfusion adequacy overall. There's a lot more that you can be looking at for sure. So it's really come a long way is my point, and it's going to continue to move forward, which is what's really exciting to me. We're not going to be stopping with DO2, indexed DO2s with the CDI platform. Well, this is the storyline on CDI. The company was founded in 1981, and their first blood gas monitoring device came out in 1984. It was called the GasStat. I started to get involved with the technologies about 1986 with the CDI-200 technology, and haven't looked back since then. And today we are up to the CDI-550, which is just releasing now. It's a brand new product to the field. So I'm sure you may have seen this particular slide or this particular ad, and it really does tell the story of why CDI is so important. If you had to drive a car by looking backwards, or if you had to drive a car by only looking intermittently at your dashboard, like say every 20 minutes, it would not be a comfortable situation at all. So the concept here is to always be looking forward, always having a continuous feed of information, because as we'll talk about in some of the papers that I'll discuss today, it's very clear, very evident that you really need to have that continuous feed of information into your system so that you can make proactive choices, get away from being a reactive type of situation all the time. Proactivity is the way to go. Basically trying to always look forward for your patient. So the goal is, right, of goal-directed perfusion is to make surgery and make bypass safer and better for your patient. The evidence, even back to the Trowbridge papers in 2000, talk about the fact that they actually could see reduced complication rates, improved times on ventilators with their small studies that they did at that point in time. But the big difference now is with the 550 is we're going to be able to give you the information to have you operate on a different level, looking at DO2s instead of looking at just isolated hemoglobins, isolated venous saturations. You're going to be able to look at a single number to assess your pump flow, your hemoglobin, and your oxygen delivery, because that's really what we're responsible for, right, when you're running the pump. It's delivering oxygen to the patient. It's nice to have a single factor that you can look at to understand that. The patient population is always changing. It's a standard these days that patients are getting older, they're getting sicker. They are more challenging today than they were 2 years ago or 5 years ago. So the benefit of CDI overall is that it gives you quick recognition of changes, and that is really important, as we'll talk about going further. Well, I mentioned Trowbridge's paper in 2000, and then a follow-up paper that was done by Jane Ottens in Australia in 2010. And interestingly, the papers, even though they were done 10 years apart and also 15,000 miles apart, really demonstrated the similar outcomes. And so it was really pretty substantial information for people to deal with. The Trowbridge paper basically said, we've learned that if we keep our blood gas parameters within our prescribed ranges, we can do better for our patients. So we don't end up with the major outliers, and we have much better control of the patient. And they were able to demonstrate in their practice that they could reduce the time on the ventilator. People could move through the ICU better. So they actually showed that they could affect outcomes for their patients, even with their small study at that time. The Trowbridge paper that came out basically supplemented that information with essentially the same type of outcomes from the work that they were doing. And so Jane made a very, very strong statement that it said, at the end of this, it says, "It is therefore difficult to build an argument for not using such technology in the routine management of patients to whom we are charged with their care." I think it's a great statement because it's exactly right. When that patient is on bypass and you're responsible for them, you are absolutely charged with their care. And what you do at that point with their care affects them down the road. It's not just when, until the patient's head leaves the operating room door that you're responsible. What you do on bypass, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, can really affect the outcome of that patient. Well, in 2005, Ranucci came out with his, what I consider a landmark piece of work, where he identified the whole concept of DO2 and actually gave perfusionists information to work from that was palatable and it made sense, and it could really be utilized very, very effectively. This is sort of a summation of that first paper, and he actually gave a perfusionist guidelines to follow, hematocrit values, how you could affect a change as far as reducing the risk associated with bypass. And so it was really strong work, but it's been slow to adopt. And I'll show you some information from a study that we did on AMSECT, getting information about that very thing. So it's very interesting how long this has taken to evolve. But I think part of the problem has been, it's really difficult to get the data in a workable format while you're on bypass. It's really hard most times to sit there with a calculator and punch numbers in while you're on the pump. And the last thing you want to do is pull out your iPhone and be using that calculator during your pump run, because the surgeon's going to think you're texting somebody, right? So you don't want to be doing that either. But it's just too much of a distraction for a lot of folks to try to do that work while they're on pump. CDI is going to take care of that issue very, very effectively. So the work from Ranucci was also followed up by work from Disposables in 2011. And he basically confirmed what Ranucci was saying in the 2005 study. So again, 272 milliliters per minute per meter squared of oxygen delivery. As long as you're above that threshold, you should be in pretty good shape as far as taking care of the gut organs and the kidneys. But he brought up the fact that, he said, well, it's good stuff, but it really needs to be verified. And it needs to be verified in a specific randomized trial. And that's now happened. The GIFT study came out in 2018 from Ranucci, and it was 9 centers, and it was multinational. So pretty powerful work. So it answered Disposables' issue about it. Well, this is one of the formulas that's out there for DO2. And so, it's very simplistic formula, really is. It's very easy to work with, and we've made it even easier to work with the CDI. I like showing this little simple nomogram. See if I can make this work. This really gives a good indication of the relationship between flow rate and hemoglobin. The green area essentially indicates where we're achieving 272 milliliters per minute per meter squared of oxygen delivery to the patient. Our patient size here is unfortunately it chose to work then. Our patient size is a BSA of 1.7. So in my practice for years, we used a cardiac index of 2. Because we did everything we could to maintain a high hemoglobin on bypass. So we thought we were doing a really good job back then. Well, when you look at a BSA of 1.7 and a cardiac index of 2, that would give us a flow of around 3.5 liters per minute. Well, what that means is I would need a hemoglobin to achieve a 272 delivery of about 11. That's a strong hemoglobin on bypass. For a small patient that would have a flow rate like that, it's pretty challenging. But you can see also, if I take my cardiac index up to an index of 3 on this and flowing 5 liters a minute, you can see what that does for my hemoglobin level. Gives me a lot more latitude in that regard. So it shows the relationship, and it shows how the numbers can work together, and that's what makes it so valuable as a tool for perfusionists. So you already saw my slide here, but it really is a balancing act of using what you can use to achieve that DO2 rating. It's either flow, hemoglobin. So there have been a number of papers come out on goal-directed perfusion, which have been really, really excellent papers, and I would highly recommend to you, if you haven't read these, to make sure you do. It's great guidance for developing a goal-directed strategy within your practice. It's all pretty logical. It's real logical, in fact. And most of it centers around controlling your hemoglobin level and controlling hemodilution on bypass. That seems to be a hallmark with this. You want to do everything you can to, one, maintain the highest hemoglobin you can on bypass, and that can be accomplished through circuit design to some degree. And two, you still want to avoid transfusion of banked blood whenever you can, because banked blood is also something that can, create an AKI situation for your patient. So you want to avoid it as much as you can. That means tailoring flow as far as you can as well. That also involves the surgeon to some degree, because if you have a surgeon who likes to flow through a pin for an aortic cannula, it could really restrict your ability to utilize flow effectively. So it's a discussion that needs to take place. So Ranucci also has made some comments about goal-directed perfusion as well. And I really like the statement, oxygen delivery is more important in renal outcome than hematocrit nadir. Again, it just reflects back on the sum of what oxygen delivery is. It's not just hemoglobin or hematocrit, it's also pump flow and the ability to control that as well. That's what controls your oxygen delivery. So implementation of a goal-directed perfusion program has been associated with these things. And the 3 papers that we list in this presentation absolutely speak to that very, very well. The CDI-550 can accept pump flow inputs so that you're not having to stand up and manually enter a pump flow every time you want to see a DO2. So it gives you a consistent readout of DO2 while you're on pump. And it allows you to see the ups and downs. This is a great statement from Kramer and Groom's work. And again, this is one of the papers that we cite in our compendium of papers. And it reminds me a lot of the work that has been done with cerebral oximetry. I'm sure everybody that's using cerebral oximetry knows the term area under the curve. Well, that's where you don't want to be, right? You don't want to be in that area under the curve very long. Well, in fact, the same thing holds true for your gut organs. And I think Kramer and Groom do a great job of stating that in this. Basically, there's not a lot of room to play here. You want to have a cushion on that DO2. You don't want to get into that area under the curve for your DO2 values either, because you can really start invoking some negative outcomes that way. Well, I mentioned to you that we did a user poll, and this was really to try to get a better understanding of where perfusionists are today and in their practice. And so we talked to AMSECT and basically ended up with 286 responses to a number of questions we posed. And the first question was about your current practice and which of the goal-directed perfusion strategies do you employ to minimize the impact of hemodilution. So you can see across the bottom we have maintain adequate nadir hematocrit. About 70% really try to do that on a routine basis. Optimize patient-specific, the rest of that sentence is circuit size. And about half of the perfusionists that responded, do some work with their circuit size, like sizing oxygenators to the size of the patient, maybe 1/2 inch versus 3/8 inch line. All of those little tricks that all add up to saving some volume. Because again, from Ranucci's work, he points out that even a savings of 150 cc's to 200 cc's can make a difference in your overall transfusion rate for a given patient. So even the small changes start to add up over time. Low prime oxygenators, again, what do we have? About 58% said that they use a low prime oxygenator in their strategies to try to preserve hemoglobin. Hemoconcentration use, very high, not surprising considering the use of del nido cardioplegia and whacking the patient with a liter to 1,500 right off the bat. You've got to do something to get rid of that pretty quickly. Modular roller pumps. What we were looking for there was just some information on, are people doing anything specific with hardware design to try to minimize their circuits? At this point, it's not a big hitter. Adjusting arterial pump flow. Again, almost as great as maintaining adequate nadir hematocrits on bypass. And then the last one was, we're doing all of these things. Well, about a third of the respondents said they were doing everything on that sheet. So this is where it sort of gets interesting. Do you currently monitor oxygen delivery during cardiopulmonary bypass? Unfortunately, that's the no column, and it's 54% of the respondents said they do not, and 44% said, or 46% said they do. So more don't than do. Are you familiar with Dr. Ranucci's research linking a critical oxygen delivery threshold during CPB to the incidence of acute kidney injury? 60% said yes, interestingly, 40% said, nope, I've not read that. Do you currently monitor oxygen delivery during cardiopulmonary bypass? 54% said they do not, and the balance said they do. And are you aware that published research states that AKI patients have twice the average ICU stay and hospital costs that eclipse the standard patient? And again, a vast majority of people said, oh yeah, we're really familiar with that. And, but it's interesting that the connection hasn't been made to practice in a great number of cases. So what that means is there's an opportunity to change. The financial impact, which is also important data, especially if you're going to talk to a hospital administrator about buying you anything, is very impactful as well. The work by Dasta was out of University of Pittsburgh, and he looked at the costs of whether or not a patient had to have renal replacement therapy or not against a control group. And basically what they showed was that patients with the least severe forms of AKI had a 2.2-fold greater mortality, 1.6-fold increase in intensive care and length of stay, 1.6% increase in total postoperative cost compared to controls. The patients that required renal replacement therapy in this study were about 5 times controls as far as costs go. So again, it should be some impetus to really start to think of how we can handle this problem of AKI more effectively. Another study that's cited is the Al-Sheikh study, and Al-Sheikh looked at basically what it is for nationally as far as costs go for treatment of AKI. And what he showed was that it's about $1 billion a year. And this was a study that took place from 2008 to 2011. So I don't know if the patients are worse today or better, but $1 billion is a lot of money to spend for something that is potentially something that we can correct and make better on the fly. The GIFT study is really exciting. This is the answer to Dee Somay's question about needing a proactive study, looking at the effects of AKI. And this was a multi-continent, multi-center study. There were 9 centers involved, and it was really a great piece of work. And the patients were randomized into 2 groups. Patients in the control group received basically what I did in my practice, which is arterial pump flow based on BSA and temperature. That's how we did our work back in 2000. And they targeted an index of 2.4 liters per minute per meter squared at normal thermia. And transfusion was just handled as they would normally handle it in that hospital. The treatment group received specific intervention, maintain DO2s, and the way they did that was by looking at pump flows. That was their basic input to try to correct a low DO2. DO2s were captured for both groups, but the control group was blinded to the value. So what did they conclude? Stage 1 AKI was reduced in the patients treated with GDP. Stage 2 and 3 did not differ between the 2 study groups. There were no significant differences in secondary outcomes. In an analysis of patients with CPB times between 1 and 3 hours, the differences in favor of the treatment arm were more pronounced. GDP strategy during CPB is effective in reducing the risk of minor patterns of AKI. Any serum increase in AKIN stage 1 score following cardiac surgery. This is where it gets interesting, and it made me think back on all the patients that I tried to evaluate the type of care I was giving them by looking at SVO2s on bypass. Median nadir SVO2 on CPB was 76% in the control arm and 77% in the GDP arm. The nadir SVO2 was 76% in patients without AKI stage 1 and 77% in patients with stage 1 AKI. So what that sort of tells me is maybe SVO2 is not a real reliable marker. It's something that you need to consider, but it should probably not be considered by itself. So interesting piece of information there. Well, the CDI-550, basically the biggest changes to it are, we had to make sure it was compliant with all the international standards. Those are always changing, so it's a challenge for any company to keep up with. The other thing is that the software has been changed to allow for expanded ranges on hematocrit and hemoglobin. And that'll be good news for our pediatric users because we made a change a few years ago that made it more difficult for them to use the product effectively. The new parameter of continuous DO2 is really there for goal-directed perfusion utilization. And so we're hoping that this technology will help really push, push that concept forward even faster. Because looking at the data that's out there, it's really worth consideration, strong consideration. So that's about all I have to say about the DO2 and the CDI-550 at this point. I'm hoping that we can interest you in, at some point evaluating the product and seeing how it factors into your practice, and look forward to any questions you might have about the technology or the techniques. And we have basically I've seen in the literature, and I think these two statements are really important to consider, is that increased use of this is from DeJoy's paper on the history of goal-directed therapy. Increased use of electronic medical records will allow perfusionists to improve patient management in a more proactive manner. The concept there, I think, is very, very good. There's still work that needs to be done as far as taking data and getting away from just having it be something you can analyze the next day to actually bringing it online so that you can use it while you're on bypass. And that's going to happen with technology moving forward for sure. The other thing that she said in her paper was that many studies have attempted to determine optimal patient management parameters. However, new evidence has shown that intensive monitoring of key parameters during critical periods of patient treatment have a profound effect on improving long-term survival. I would say to you that I think anytime a patient is on bypass, that's a fairly critical period in that patient's treatment. And so, we really need to promote doing great monitoring during that period of time, and then taking that data and incorporating it into our care strategies going forward. So I'm really excited about this technology. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to come and talk to you about it. I wish I would have had it in 1981. I probably would have done a much better job for a lot of patients that I was involved in. But we can't look back. All we can do is look forward. So thank you very much for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.